Hello friends, welcome once again. I am Dr. Anjuman Borah. In a previous module on children and media, we established the context for children's communication rights. We also discussed about what media professionals can do to create a more child-friendly media environment. In this module, we will take the discussion a little further and concentrate particularly on the role of journalists in this regard. Media has a key function to play in a democracy. A role that is commonly attributed to journalists is that of being watchdogs, to act as the eyes, ears and voices of the people by monitoring what is happening in public life and calling attention to issues that deserve public attention. Journalists are either trained or in the course of their jobs develop expertise in covering different beats like politics, sports, business, crime, education, etc. However, there is no separate child beat in the Indian media, with children and their issues remaining a low priority for most media houses. In fact, the understanding of the child rights sector among journalists is pretty limited. This is a cause for concern as it often leads to insensitive coverage and sensational stories which run the risk of distorting the truth. Unfortunately, in many cases, reporting about children places them or other children at risk of retribution or stigmatization. Amu Joseph, a well-known Indian journalist and media analyst, observes that when children are mentioned in news reports, it is generally as victims of crime, as victims or survivors of abuse, violent conflicts, disasters, and or socio-economic deprivation, as recipients of charity or beneficiaries of welfare schemes, as participants in cultural or sports events, or as winners of various kinds of competitive events. Reporting on children is no doubt a challenge, and if such stereotyping in the portrayal of children in media is to be forestalled, it is important to strengthen the proficiency of the media professionals to engage in more ethical and right-sensitive journalistic practices. In this slide, the objective of this module are to discuss about the ethical principles for reporting on children and explore story ideas for generating news stories and features covering child rights. The major concern in reporting about children is how to do so in a way that ensures their rights are not compromised. In this regard, UNICEF developed a set of ethical guidelines for reporting on children. These guidelines are meant to support journalists and their best interests in covering issues affecting children. I would like to quote from these guidelines to highlight the main principles of ethical reporting on children. These principles are: number 1, the dignity and rights of every child are to be respected in every circumstance. Number 2, in interviewing and reporting on children, special attention is to be paid to each child's right to privacy and confidentiality, to have their opinions heard, to participate in decisions affecting them, and to be protected from harm and retribution, including the potential of harm and retribution. The best interests of each child are to be protected over any other consideration, including over advocacy for children's issues and the promotion of child rights. When trying to determine the best interest of a child, the child's right to have their views taken into account are to be given due weight in accordance with their age and maturity. Those closest to the child's situation and best able to assess it are to be consulted about the political, social and cultural ramifications of any reportage. Do not publish a story or an image which might put the child, siblings or peers at risk even when identities are changed, obscured or not used. Another major concern is in terms of interviewing children. There are contentions that a general tendency among journalists is to use these voices to pepper their preconceived stories. In such a scenario, children are reduced to characters to merely augment the journalist's stand or viewpoint, rather than being brought in as active participants to present their own perspectives. Children are made to speak through the lens of adult experience rather than through their own. Again, speaking to a journalist can at times be an intimidating prospect for a child, particularly when it's a new experience or when they are already in a traumatized state. Sometimes they agree for interviews without realizing that what they say might put them or others in danger. When children may not be aware of their own vulnerabilities or rights, it is the responsibility of journalists to be sensitive to these matters when they interview children. Let me again quote from the UNICEF guidelines on interviewing children. Number 1, do no harm to any child. Avoid questions, attitudes or comments that are judgmental, insensitive to cultural values, that place a child in danger or expose a child to humiliation, or that reactivate a child's pain and grief from traumatic events. Number 2, do not discriminate in choosing children to interview because of gender, race, age, religion, status, educational background, or physical abilities. Do not ask children to tell a story or take an action that is not part of their own history. The interviews should not be staged. Number 4, ensure that the child or guardian knows they are talking with a reporter. Explain the purpose of the interview and its intended use. Number 5, obtain permission from the child and his or her guardian for all interviews, videotaping, and when possible, for documentary photographs. When possible and appropriate, this permission should be in writing. Permission must be obtained in circumstances that ensure the child and guardian are not coerced in any way and that they understand they are part of a story that might be disseminated locally and globally. This is usually ensured only if the permission is obtained in the child's language and if the decision is made in consultation with the adult the child trusts. Number 6, pay attention to where and how the child is interviewed. Limit the number of interviewers and photographers. Try to make certain that children are comfortable and able to tell their story without external pressure, including that from the interviewer. In film, video and radio interviews, consider what the choice of visual or audio background could imply about the child and his or her life and story. Ensure that the child will not be in any form of danger or adversely affected by showing their home, community or general whereabouts in the interview. Just as it is important to be vigilant about how children are interviewed, it is equally important to keep in mind the safety and well-being of the child when compiling the final news story for broadcasting or for publication. Let's look at some guidelines for this. Number 1, do not further stigmatize any child. Avoid categorizations or descriptions that expose a child to negative reprisals, including additional physical or psychological harm or lifelong abuse or discrimination or rejection by the local communities. Number 2, always provide an accurate context for the child's story or image. Number 3, always change the name and obscure the visual identity of any child who is identified as a victim of sexual abuse or exploitation, a perpetrator of physical or sexual abuse, HIV positive, or living with AIDS unless the child, a parent or a guardian gives fully informed consent, or charged or convicted of a crime. Number 4, in certain circumstances of risk or potential risk of harm or retribution, change the name and obscure the visual identity of any child who is identified as a current or former child combatant, or an asylum seeker, a refugee or an internal displaced person, Number 5. In certain cases, using a child's identity, that is their name or recognizable image, is in the child's best interests. However, when the child's identity is used, they must still be protected against harm and supported through any stigmatization or reprisals. Some examples of these special cases are: A. When a child initiates contact with the reporter wanting to exercise their rights to freedom of expression and their right to have their opinion heard. When a child is part of a sustained program of activism or social mobilization and wants to be so identified. When a child is engaged in a psychosocial program and claiming their name and identity is part of their healthy development. Number 6. Confirm the accuracy of what the child has to say, either with other children or an adult, preferably with both. Number 7. When in doubt about whether a child is at risk, report on the general situation for children rather than on an individual child, no matter how newsworthy the story. The profession of journalism carries with it a substantial measure of responsibilities. Children's powerlessness and vulnerability increases this to a great extent. These responsibilities include giving children access to the media in a safe manner, portraying children faithfully without manipulation or exploitation, respecting their privacy, and being conscious about the consequences of one's reportage on children. It is highly recommended that journalists follow the ethical guidelines while interviewing and reporting on children so that they can fulfill these responsibilities to the maximum extent and work in the best interest of children. Having discussed about these ethical issues, let us now try to address another challenge that journalists commonly face given their limited exposure and understanding of child rights. The challenge is how to generate suitable ideas for their news stories. Fortunately, the answer lies in the UNCRC itself. Thorough understanding of the various provisions of the UNCRC and attempting to evaluate the extent of actual realization of the rights therein can be the starting point for rights-sensitive coverage of children. Another step would be to examine the constitutional provisions, laws, policies, systems, mechanisms and services available in our country to make the realization of these rights possible and measure their adequacy and efficacy against the actual situation of children. Some ideas for generating news stories and features covering child rights. The rights enshrined within UNCRC are generally categorized into 4 groups: right to survival, right to protection, right to development, and right to participation. A journalist wanting to cover child rights can start off by examining the individual rights and their realization. Let us begin with discussing about survival rights. Survival means having basic needs met. Survival rights include Article 6, the right to life, and Article 24, the right to health care and the right to enough food and clean water. To generate stories with regard to this category of rights, journalists can look out for official reports and statistics about child health in the country, the state or district as per requirement. Important indicators to look out for include infant and child mortality rates, levels of preventable childhood diseases, and the mechanisms put in place by the government to address them. Journalists can also investigate into the adequacy of state health services, immunization programs, and the overall management of maternal and child health care. Are hospital services for children child-friendly? Are there special provisions and support systems for treatment of children with HIV/AIDS? These can be important aspects to look into. Journalists can also investigate the measures taken by the state to combat malnutrition and the status of availability of clean drinking water to all children. There can also be stories regarding parents and children's access or lack of it with regard to education and whether they are supported in the use of basic knowledge of child health and nutrition, the advantages of breastfeeding, hygiene and environmental sanitation. Let us now come to the second category, protection rights, that is, protection from harmful influence. Protection rights include Article 19, the right not to be hurt or neglected, Article 32, the right not to be used as cheap workers, Article 36, the right to be protected from danger, and Article 38, the right not to be used as a soldier in wars. There are innumerable news stories that can be done with regard to protection rights. Let me just give a few examples. Journalists can do stories about the state's efforts or failures to protect children from exploitation. It may be economic exploitation, sexual exploitation, or any other form. They can investigate and report on hidden forms of child labor like secret factories, bonded labor, prostitution, girls being kept away from schools to act as help, etc. Reporters can also throw light on the living and working conditions of children on the street. What hours do they work? What are the problems they face? Are they being compensated adequately for their work? Do they have enough time for rest or study? Are they working by choice or are they free to leave? It is important to investigate and report on the sexual abuse and exploitation of children. Rather than merely reporting sensational stories of crimes against children after they have been committed, journalists can take a more proactive role to examine the extent to which children are safe in schools, shelters and care homes, and in juvenile detention homes. They can find out about what measures the management has taken to ensure safety. Is corporal punishment prohibited, and is the prohibition effectively enforced? Are there adequate mechanisms in place for all children, including the disabled and detainees, to safely lodge complaints about abuse within their family, school or institutions? How is the confidentiality, protection, support and counseling for children arranged in such cases? How effective is the protection of children from sexual offences, that is POCSO Act, in dealing with issues of sexual violence on children? Is there adequate number of special children's courts available as mandated in the Act? Are these courts child-friendly and functioning as specified within the rules of the Act? Journalists can also report on various aspects of the juvenile justice law and about how child-friendly its provisions are. Does the law differentiate in the way it treats adult offenders and juvenile offenders? Does the justice system focus on rehabilitation or retribution? Are judges, lawyers, police and other duty bearers trained about children's rights? How do the police treat children, especially homeless children and those in conflict with the law? These are important questions to ask, and the journey leading to their answers can end with perceptive news reports that highlight the status of children's protection rights in India. Let us now move on to developmental rights. Development includes the education and experience that allow a child to successfully develop into an adult. The relevant UNCRC articles are Article 9, the right to be with their parents or with those who will care for them best. Article 23, the right to special care, education and training if needed. Article 28, the right to a free primary education, and Article 31, the right to play. A very interesting but rarely covered topic for generating news stories or feature articles includes aspects of children's care within their families and in foster care, as the case might be. Children are often put into unconventional and challenging circumstances as a result of parents' untimely death, separation, or other compelling issues. These can become the fuel for generating human interest stories that look at how children are affected by these circumstances and whether there are mechanisms in place to ensure prioritization of the best interest of the children. For instance, are family laws and divorce procedures fair and take into account the best interest of children? Do courts allow children to have a say in deciding their custody post the parents' divorce? What happens to children when either or both parents are imprisoned? Can imprisoned mothers keep their babies with them? Journalists can investigate into whether the effect on children is considered before parents are imprisoned. How are these children cared for or rehabilitated? How are children caught up in such circumstances dealing with the situation? Such reportage can help attract the attention of people and organizations that are well placed to bring about change. Journalists can also report on efforts by organizations trying to improve the situation. Another theme that requires investigation is the right to education. In India, all children up to the age of 14 are guaranteed the right to free education under the Right to Education Act 2010. However, it is important to investigate into the actual extent of realization of this right for all children. Are there infrastructure, resources, mechanisms and monitoring systems to ensure that this happens? Are there equal opportunities for all children within the education system? For example, girls and boys, rural and urban, those with disabilities and members of minority communities? What is the percentage of out of school children and why aren't they within the ambit of the system? What measures is the government taking to mainstream such children? It is also important to understand things from the quality perspective. What is the nature of the student-teacher ratio? Do class sizes make a difference? How good are the learning levels? Another matter to report on is regarding the right to play. Stories can highlight the lack of public play facilities, particularly in urban areas and for disadvantaged children. Journalists can also generate stories based on children's articulation of their understanding of this right, expression of their needs for rest and leisure, and to engage in play and recreational activities. Now let us talk about story ideas for reporting on the fourth category of rights, the participation rights. Participation here refers to children taking part in the wider society and having an input into relevant decisions. The participatory provisions of the UNCRC are Article 12, the right to have a say about things that affect them. Article 13, the right to get information they need. Article 14, the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. Article 15, the right to meet with other children. Article 16, the right to privacy. Article 17, the right to freedom of association and peaceful assembly. Article 30, the right to speak their own language. Article 42, the right to know about their rights and responsibilities. When you compare the various range of rights, you will see that participation rights are the most neglected, particularly in a country like India, where children are mostly viewed as subjects of adult care and protection. As a result, adequate media reportage is of paramount importance to draw attention to this issue, aid in changing traditional attitudes towards children, and promote their right to have a voice and choice in matters concerning them. Journalists can review government policies and actions for promoting children's participation rights and report on their efficiency. They can also investigate into how participatory and child-friendly are these children's everyday spaces. For instance, do schools have democratic structures like students' councils or Bal Sansads to allow for participatory school management? How do these councils function? Can the students influence rules and discipline procedures through these councils? What are the parental notions on children's right to be heard? Feature stories can be done on changing trends in this regard. There can also be reportage on good practices like the formation of Bal Panchayats or children's councils in certain places which follow the model of Panchayati Raj institutions and have linkage with the adult local governance bodies. There can be reports about the positive outcomes of such practices and features on children who are part of these initiatives. Journalists can also produce features on youth clubs and other associations for young people, particularly those managed by children themselves. Again, it is important to investigate children's access to information. Do they have access to relevant and useful information from a wide variety of sources? Are they trained in media literacy? Do they know how to protect themselves from harmful material? Are they made aware of their rights? Where are the gaps? Are there interventions in schools to educate children on citizenship and how the political processes operate? These are pertinent questions for a journalist to ask. Apart from reporting on the realization of the rights to survival, development, protection and participation of children, journalists can also generate stories that look into the responsibility and efficiency of the state in implementing the Convention on the Rights of the Child. They can monitor the activities of the Ministry of Women and Child Development and the Commissions for Protection of Child Rights at the national and state levels in dealing with children's issues and problems. Reporters can interview those responsible for supervising implementation of the convention in the country and challenge them about lack of progress. Has the government complied with the requirement to publicize the convention's principles and provisions? Is child rights taught in schools? How has the government involved non-governmental organizations in its efforts to improve the lives of children? These answers must be sought. Journalists can also help promote children's voices by including children and young people when seeking opinions about local and national government policies. They can publicize the views of the children, especially about welfare, education, or infrastructure projects that directly affect them in the short term. Journalists can also encourage children to express their opinions about their visions and plans for their own future and the future of the country. By encouraging children to express their views and giving them the platform to do so, journalists play the role of catalysts in promoting children's rights. Many of the story ideas that we have discussed here have been drawn from a handbook for journalists developed by the UK-based organization MediaWise. The handbook is titled The Media and Child Rights. While the handbook takes an international perspective, the examples in this module have been contextualized to the situation in our own country. It is recommended as an essential reading for journalists wanting to take up reporting on children and for media educators guiding media students in this direction. I hope the ethical guidelines and story ideas for reporting on children discussed in this module will be helpful to media educators to encourage and steer the future journalists to prioritize child rights reporting and thus fulfill their social responsibility towards the country's children. In the next module, I will discuss about curricularizing the process of reporting about children and by children. This will help guide my colleagues and peers to undertake children's reporting workshops in the nearby schools, giving the students of communication an opportunity to train and prepare the school children as reporters and content creators. Thank you so much for listening.